The world needs a cure for COVID-19, but most experts agree that's at least 18 months away. Some say it's possible to produce one quicker, but it means cutting corners. Is fast-tracking a solution, playing with people's lives, or helping save them? I'm Imran Gata, and today on The Newsmakers, we'll look at the race to develop a coronavirus vaccine. With any disease outbreak comes the demand for a cure, and COVID-19 is no exception. In past weeks, predictions of a timeline for when that might happen have flooded our screens, as have stories about the viability of medicines that already exist. Today's show will focus on the global quest for a vaccine. Can anything be done to speed up the process, and would it be ethical? But first, Natalie Perhonen explains what it entails.
12 months. That's the target to find a coronavirus vaccine that academic institutions, biotech and pharmaceutical companies have given themselves. This isn't a race against each other, it's a race against the virus. Developing vaccines doesn't happen overnight, but there are more than 30 candidates for a vaccine and they're being worked on right now. In January, Chinese researchers released the genetic sequence of the novel coronavirus, which can cause the disease COVID-19. Scientists around the world are using that information to try to develop a vaccine. That involves animal testing to see if antibodies to the virus are developed. If that's successful, the next stage involves clinical trials. Normally, these start with less than 100 people. If successful, then hundreds of people, and then ultimately trials with thousands of people. Then regulatory approval is required. Not all teams who start this race will finish. Experimental vaccines that are ineffective or aren't safe won't continue to be worked on. This whole process normally takes years. But we are in extraordinary times. US researchers in Seattle have already given the first injection of an experimental coronavirus vaccine to the first adult, a healthy woman.
I hope that we get to a working vaccine quickly and that we can save lives and that people can go back to life as soon as possible.
The World Health Organization says it will take at least a year for a vaccine to be developed, and that it will also take time to manufacture enough vaccines for potentially billions of people. But they also have this message: to do as much as we can to slow down the spread of the virus to protect lives now, before a vaccine can help us in the future. Natalie Perhonen, The Newsmakers.
One of those scientists is Jake Glanville. He's the co-founder and CEO of Distributed Bio, a biotech startup working on a therapeutic antibody to neutralize the coronavirus. He's also featured in the Netflix documentary series Pandemic: How to Prevent an Outbreak. I spoke to him recently about what needs to be done to get a vaccine on the market.
A vaccine takes time to develop. There's a process first where you have to manufacture the vaccine, and groups like Moderna and others have come up with very clever methods to manufacture the vaccines very quickly. But once you've manufactured it, you need to go test it in humans. And there are three tests or three challenges that we apply to every medicine. The first is called a phase 1 study, and you're giving your vaccine to healthy individuals and then monitoring them for a while to make sure that it does not hurt them. Once that test is passed, then you give it to a large number of individuals. And this is where vaccines are slow, because when you give a vaccine to a person, what you're doing is giving little pieces of the virus and you're injecting it into them, and then you're waiting for their immune system to respond to those pieces of the virus. And that could take 6 or 7 weeks. At that point, the person has lots of antibodies protecting them. But because it takes 6 or 7 weeks, you cannot give the vaccine to sick people because they're going to die or recover within 10 days, right? And so you don't have enough time for them to produce antibodies, which means what you have to do is give your vaccine to a whole bunch of healthy people, wait 6 or 7 weeks for them to develop immunity, and then you need to monitor them for months afterwards to look at statistical changes on whether or not they get sick or not. And that's a slow process. And that's really the reason we're talking about 18 months here, is we're talking about these long studies where they're checking to see, does the medicine help and is it safe? Now that's the long track. And here's the good news. There are ways to make medicines much faster. My group's working on this, and so are others. The fastest way to make a medicine is to take existing drugs and repurpose them. So chloroquine, Kaletra, remdesivir, these were medicines against malaria, HIV, and Ebola, respectively, and they're being repurposed. So they're trying to see if an existing drug could work on the new outbreak. If that is successful, that is the fastest way to start distributing pills out to hospitals and then making this less of a deadly or very serious disease, which is enough just to shift that distribution to make this more manageable, and it would be less of a global crisis. The challenge with repurposing existing drugs is that usually doesn't work that well. So remdesivir didn't work that well on Ebola. It may not work that well here, and the same for the other drugs. So the next thing we can do, and that's what my laboratory is working on, is rather than making a vaccine and making the person produce antibodies, you can skip the middleman and just make the antibody directly. And so we are working on engineering antibodies that were neutralizing the SARS virus, and we are engineering them to adapt them to now recognize and neutralize the novel coronavirus. So these were extremely well-studied antibodies that were discovered back in 2002 during the SARS outbreak. And then 2 years of research went into understanding them, that they would protect an animal if they were mixed with the SARS virus. They can neutralize the SARS virus in a petri dish. We know exactly how these antibodies behave. And so my team is just engineering them to make them into a medicine. And the advantage of an antibody is that, unlike a vaccine, you give the antibody to a patient, and then within 20 minutes, it's in their blood and it can protect them. And so that is useful because you can give it to patients. It means that the studies are very short because you give them to a bunch of patients, and within 10 days, you know your answer. Did the drug work in protecting lives? And that means those studies can happen very quickly. So we are contemplating running a phase 1/2 study over the summer in humans, and that would be enough information to justify what's called a compassionate use release, which means we can start releasing the drug in the fall, potentially as early as September.
Let us debate the timelines and the ethics now. Joining me from London is epidemiology professor Peter Smith. He's the co-author of a Harvard study on accelerating a coronavirus vaccine. In New York, we have Dr. Benhur Lee. He was on the vaccine panel for the American Society of Microbiology Summit on COVID-19. And in Stockholm is Annelies Wilder-Smith. She's a professor of emerging infectious diseases at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she specializes in vaccine-preventable diseases. It's good to have you all on the Newsmakers. Thanks so much. Peter Smith, I think a lot of us now understand that all this social distancing, the lockdowns and all these extreme measures are not going to cure the virus. They're merely to buy us time, right? Buy our healthcare systems enough time to manage this properly, and also to allow the experts enough time to come up with medicines and eventually a vaccine. Do we have to get a move on that? Do we have to maybe take out some of the steps that we traditionally have in producing something like a vaccine and treat this with more urgency? Can it be done, Peter?
Well, clearly, the availability of a vaccine is going to be crucial in controlling this epidemic. In the short run, it may be possible to develop effective treatments, but there's no guarantee of that. And I think in the long run, we really do need a vaccine. And the sooner we have that vaccine, the better. Or we need several vaccines. The challenge is going to be to actually reduce the time that it takes to test and evaluate a vaccine so that it's ready to be widely distributed. Normally, that process takes typically sort of 5 years or more through the whole procedures that are normally adopted for vaccines. The hope is with this vaccine, COVID-19, it will be possible, or the estimates are it may be possible to do it in 12 to 18 months' time. And what we've suggested just recently is a way in which we think it might be possible to speed it up even beyond that a bit.
Dr. Lee, what's the price of rushing?
I don't think rushing and being safe are dichotomous choices. So it's a false dichotomy. As Peter has said, and he has consulted from CEPI, and have nothing but respect for his words, obviously. But there is already a process in place, and if this comes vaccines with the plural is the correct idea. If this comes to fall in 12 to 18 months, that would be the fastest it's been done. And professional organizations like the Brighton Collaboration, which is now the global, the Task Force in Global Health, and other agencies have worked with CEPI to fast track this in a safe way. There are too many unknowns about this virus. And the paper was written in a very bioethical way, talking about autonomy and human challenges. But placebo-controlled phase 3 trials is not the only trial design that's fast and that can get to efficacy. There's just too much we do not know about this virus, and the information is coming in. What we say today may be out of date 2 days later. So I think we had to be careful.
Right. Annelies Wilder-Smith, already in terms of expectation, people expect to have a vaccine within 12 to 18 months, because that's been a timeline that's been given to people to say, well, best case scenario, 12 to 18 months. Is there a danger that we're all expecting too much now, and maybe we're going to end up really disappointed if we don't have that vaccine come 18 months' time?
I think we have to have guarded optimism while still focusing on employing and scaling up all our non-pharmaceutical interventions to try to contain the epidemic. We still need to go in parallel with a diversity of vaccines to make sure that we have at least one winner. And whilst we are all trying and working really hard around the clock to accelerate the process, speed is necessary, but we should not cut corners. Vaccines must be safe, and we need to take the necessary steps to ensure this.
Right. Benhur Lee, if I had to look at, and forgive me, I'm trying to understand this as we go along. I'm a medical idiot, and this is one of the reasons why I ask you all the basic questions. So two things trying to happen simultaneously. Vaccines as an end game, and the other thing, treatment, right? So we've spoken to experts who say, well, we're looking for treatment. We're looking to cut out the middleman, as Jay Glanville's trying to do, and produce antibodies. Is it maybe safer to try and fast track that process? Is there less downside to trying to fast track that process of finding a medicine for COVID-19?
They're not fast tracking. I mean, medicines have to be done the right way too, although, in theory, depending on the therapy, it could be fast track, like this human plasma consortium. That human plasma therapy is a 70-year-old technology. It's built into the blood banking sector. And so that doesn't need to be FDA approved per se, because the process is FDA approved, right? So we have to talk about what kind of different statements. But let me just make one statement here. The situation is moving so fast. The epidemiology is coming out. This is not Armageddon, right? Because as much as local lockdown and social distancing is going to work, at some point when we ramp up serology testing, people are going to be seroconverted that we don't even know about, right? That's the only way you can explain some of the flattening cases that's coming out in China, and so if the way to do this is that if we test for people who have recovered, these are the people that we can slowly release back into society to get the economy going again, so that no corners of anything that you've suggested needs to be cut, because the situation is so fluid. We have to be consistent in our criteria. We have to uphold, manage expectations, because if we get this wrong, we will never earn the trust of the public back again. Because there's enough anti-vaxxers out.
Right.
Yes.
Peter Smith?
I think it's not a choice. We have to actually try to fast track as rapidly as we can both vaccines and treatments. Treatments are not going to be the answer wholly, but clearly if we can stop people dying, and many thousands of people are dying, and the predictions are, for example, a recent estimate from the Imperial College Group in London suggested that even with mitigation measures globally, something of the order of 20 million people are likely to die beyond the end of the year. So this is a very, very major epidemic, and anything that can be done to stem that must be done.
Okay, but let me ask you, Peter Smith, right? Okay, so distribution, say at the very end, distributing this cure or vaccine or whatever it is, that can possibly be fast-tracked with political will and people coming together and deciding this is going to be helpful to humanity. But what about the the prior steps? Because we have, for example, Dr. Benhur Lee saying, when you try and fast track that stuff, it can be very dangerous. So in the engineering of it, in the technical stuff, or in the testing phase, how is it possible to safely fast track that without moving away from medical principles that were set in stone for a long, long time in order to keep medical science safe, sir?
Well, certainly, I mean, what we're proposing is that the initial studies, which are normally done in animals, and then the early studies in humans to find out what's the appropriate dose of vaccine and whether it's safe in a relatively small number of people, should be done as rapidly as possible. But the major step in the evaluation of most vaccines is what's called a phase 3 trial, where a large number of people are randomized to either receive a vaccine or to receive a placebo. And then those several thousand people, at least, are followed until some of them develop disease. And we compare the incidence of disease in those who've had the placebo and those who've had the vaccine. And that enables us to know whether the vaccine is efficacious or not. That process, we don't really know how long it's going to take with COVID-19, but it might take 6 months or more, maybe even longer, because for ethical reasons, all of the people in such trials are advised in the way in which advised as how they can best avoid infection. So actually getting enough cases to evaluate the vaccine is likely to be a challenge. What we're suggesting is a way of fast tracking this, albeit with some risks, but we think it might be a way of evaluating the vaccine. Right. That at least should be given serious consideration. And that's to do essentially human challenge studies. So we take a group of people who are at very low risk of developing disease. We can't say they're at zero risk, but of developing serious disease. And that appears to be young people. And at the moment, we've said that should be people between 20 and 45. We give some of them a vaccine. We give some of them a placebo, and then we challenge them. Right. We actually give them an infectious dose of the virus and see how many come down with disease. And we will get results from that sort of study within a few weeks, maybe a month or two at the most, much faster than the conventional phase 3 studies.
Okay. And
now, there are obviously...
If you don't mind, sir, allow me to come in here because I'm curious to hear what Annelies and Benhur both think about this. Annelies, extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. Are you partial to that type of tinkering with the phase 3 of the studies?
So first of all, I think the message is we are already fast tracking. The first vaccines already in human trials. We started in January, and now by end of March, we're already in phase 1 trial for one of the vaccine candidates. Indeed, I agree with Peter Smith. The phase 3 trials is the part that is most time consuming. So we need to target high risk populations, and so study designs need to be developed to ensure that within a short time you get a high incidence. So high risk populations are healthcare workers or are the contacts of the contacts. So for the Ebola vaccine, we know that recruiting the contacts of the contacts enabled a relative accelerated efficacy trial, and we're now using Ebola vaccine based on this ring trial. In terms of the human challenge studies, as we know, this is ethically very challenging. As time moves on, we do see more severe disease and adverse outcomes, including death, even in children, adolescents, and younger adults. So this is, it is a high-risk pathogen. For human challenge studies, we would need to ensure, indeed, that it would be so attenuated that we would not see severe outcomes in those healthy volunteers who are being challenged.
Right. Benhur Lee?
Annelies took the words right off my mouth, because we have so much experience now with the Ebola epidemic. I mean, there are very innovative phase 3 trials, and that can be done faster and with greater statistical power because this is even spreading more than Ebola. So we have the SIEVE trial, is that correct? And the PRIME trials from Sierra Leone and Guinea, where they did it in healthcare workers, and they look at incidence of of transmission, and we have the ring vaccination. Those were done in less than 3 months. And once the data came in, I know the initial set wasn't done fast enough, but the last set in the Democratic Republic of Congo, that was done in 3 months, and the EMA approved it in 4 months. And so it is possible if you have the right population to do it. Now, I'm just trying to say that, everything should be discussed, and it will be discussed rationally. I've consulted bioethicists on the NIH Next Track board. We will be writing a response to this. But let's just say one of the proposal was about autonomy and safety. And let's say he's saying putting 100 people with the highest healthcare in settings when transmissions are high. Okay, New York City. We don't, right across my street, we're building a 1,000-bed in Javits Center. Do we have extra personnel and PPE to track 100 personnel in private rooms because they're giving them human challenge? We don't even know what the infectious dose is. And it's not what you put into the humans, it's what they're exposed to in the environment. That's what the vaccine needs to protect against. How to translate whatever we find in a controlled setting, it's not clear.
Peter Smith, couple things. Not knowing, as was mentioned by Benhur Lee, not knowing about the infectious dose, because we're seeing some people getting particularly hard hit by it and some people getting mild symptoms. Now, there's questions about whether, healthcare workers get a bigger dose of it than other people and so on. And also, as the news unveils itself hideously every day of more and more people dying from it, we're seeing a lot of 30-year-olds, a lot of 40-year-olds, and so on. So with that in mind, does it make you maybe step back for a second and pause for a moment and think, well, maybe perhaps we'll be putting these volunteers at risk? Maybe it's not as clear-cut that it's only old people that are most at risk, sir?
I think what you've got to remember is that these people are at risk of natural infection anyway. And the likelihood is, in the absence of a vaccine, these young people would be infected anyway, and they will get naturally exposed to the COVID-19 agent, and they will be at risk from that. So all we would essentially be doing is actually potentially moving their infection forward a little bit. But the likelihood is they're going to be at risk from natural infection anyway. And in this sort of study, they would probably have access to better care for their infection than they would have certainly in the middle of a large epidemic. With respect to the issues of infectious dose, I mean, that's an important question. And as we specify in the paper, this would require some prior studies so that we actually have a dose which doesn't produce any more severe disease than is acquired through natural infection.
Annelies Wilder-Smith, my final question for you, ma'am. As we take all the timelines away, fast tracking and everything, I just, big picture question, are we going to solve this? Are you confident we will actually get a vaccine?
So if I had to put all my money into intervention, it is now the drugs. What we really want is to prevent deaths. And therapeutics can be developed faster, and we can repurpose already existing drugs, and currently trials are going on that direction. But obviously, so drugs will reduce deaths. But what we also want to prevent new infections, and for that we need vaccines. Whether vaccines will come in time, or whether we've already have peaked in the epidemic and are on the tail end, we can't say. Whatever this virus is going around the world, it's different to influenza. It is more like a firework, a cluster here, a hotspot there. It is probably moving slower than, for example, influenza. And major pathogy is awaiting us in India, Africa, and countries with high population densities that do not have the healthcare infrastructure. So even if we in the West manage to replicate what China did and now contain this virus in the next few months with extreme measures that other countries may not be able to do so, and whatever it is, we need a vaccine.
Benhur Lee, my final question to you. I know you said it's not Armageddon, but is our world going to be fundamentally very different over the next year, 18 months, 2 years even, in trying to tackle this virus?
I always have hope. And, science in 2020, with precision immunology, the world resources are coming together. We will beat this. I'm not trying to downplay this. We already have solutions. There are very smart people, I'm not one of them, out there who have proposed very rational solutions. We just need healthcare work. We just need the governments to understand. Governments have beaten this already. Singapore, Hong Kong, there's no lockdown. There's, these are examples that can be replicated, right? So you serology test people who have recovered and let them back and get the economy going. This is going to be 50% of the population. So, by next season come, let the science catch up. I have no doubt whether it's repurposing the 4 global trials right now to crowdsource the drugs that are available out there. And, I have to say this, that, the medicine, one thing, it's like, don't treat the worst cases. Of course, you're not going to see the effect, right? If the medicine is safe, do the cost-benefit analysis and see whether you use it for prophylaxis, for high-risk responders. When we do it in the test tube, it always looks better when the drug is present before or in the very early cases, just like acetaminophen for influenza. So I think that mentality needs to be changed. I have no doubt that we will have something to bridge us before a vaccine can become available.
Well, we hope so. Benhur Lee, Annelies Wilder-Smith, and Peter Smith, it's been a pleasure listening to all of you here on the Newsmakers. Hope you'll come back onto the program sometime soon. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.